Well, first, congratulations, because the fact it's 2016, but I think 2017, we still having first is significant there.
So across the street from the White House, the building called Treasury Annex. Abraham Lincoln in 1865 signed legislation, Freedmen's Bureau, which created the Freedmen's Bank. The Freedmen's Bank's mission, teach free slaves about money. He thought the most important thing to do after the Civil War was to bring blacks into the free enterprise system. 2 months before that was 40 acres and a mule. It showed actually 15. So he had 40 acres, well, he had 400,000 acres, then you had the mule, that was January, February, then you had a bank to finance the crops, and then he was killed in April. Frederick Douglass tried to run the bank in Lincoln's absence, but the bank had been pimped and manipulated. The bank
And Douglas put in
$10,000 of his own money, $20 million.
$20 million.
No broke man.
Come on.
So he wasn't just an abolitionist, he was a businessman that owned property in Baltimore and Anacostia. In fact, his property is still there in Anacostia today, we should go tour it. And he had the freedom to be able to say what he wanted, do what he wanted, and go write his own check to a government he knew wouldn't get the money back. When the bank failed, he said the failure of this bank did more to set free slaves in America back than 10 more years of slavery. And that was 1874. Pop your fingers. You fast forward 100 years, Dr. King and my mentor, Andrew Young, our mentor, 68, in Memphis with the Poor People's Campaign, trying to redistribute wealth, and he gets killed before his first march on Washington. Here's my theory. It's not like we tried free enterprise and capitalism and ownership and then we screwed it up. We never got the memo. There's a memo on money and free enterprise, and we never got the memo, and I'm going to help deliver the memo. So we renamed the Freedmen's Bank, the Treasury Annex building, the Freedmen's Bank building, January this year, so nobody seems to know about it. And we're opening 1,000 open side locations.
We covered on TV once.
Yes, you did. We're opening 1,000 open side locations inside of bank branches, inside of grocery stores, big box retailers, hospitals, houses of fame, government offices. Ebenezer was the first one. And people say I'm a dreamer, people say I'm crazy. I have 400 orders in 2 years. We're moving credit scores 120 points in 24 months. And nothing changes your life more than God I love and moving your credit score 120 points, because 700 credit score communities don't riot. 500 credit score communities riot. And so we're going to move the economics up, we're going to get the GDP up, we're going to create homeowners and entrepreneurs, and make this so that banks can say yes to borrowers versus if you 500 credit score, they're going to say no to you. I don't care what color you are. You 550 credit score, 580 credit score, 620 credit, you still don't get a no. You're 680, you're 700. My mother's 815. They don't even know what race she is. The answer is yes. Whatever my mother wants, yes. So we have popped the bank referral approval rate at all these places we're at. We're in Whole Foods because their employees need it. We're in Hyatt hotels because their employees need it. We're at Ebenezer Church. We're in city halls. We're in Ferguson, Missouri. We're in 40 banks. First in our profit every time.
So black banks, bro?
We're going into black banks.
Freedom's Bank failed because the speculators spent all the money. Black veterans put their money in those banks. It wasn't because of black financial illiteracy.
Oh, no, absolutely. I mean, manipulated.
So will this ultimately mean you will have institutions we own and control? Because that's what gets you political power. Yeah, Fred Douglass, as you know, they made him the ambassador to Haiti. Got down there, and the Haitians said, we're not talking to you while the government already told us you're not in charge. So in other words, this isn't just about a few individuals getting wealth. This is about institutions. Is that what's
so be clear, I'm a non-profit, just so you know. Yeah, I'm a non-profit. So we take, in fact, all our services are free. Everything I just told you.
Subsidized by white banks that are going to make a lot of money.
Yeah, I want them to make money.
Yeah,
I want them to make money. Did anybody hear this? I want you to make money. What's wrong with? I want you to make money.
Now it begins to unravel. See, this is the important
Unravel
individuals. Capitalism, the lie they sell us is about individuals.
You're a capitalist.
Listen, man, when we look back to the Trumps, you see these grifters. These grifters are
Please don't go put my name and his in the same
Well, no, but you're not thinking about institution building.
So here's a question I'll pose to y'all. Because first of all, let me say this here. I've only got about 4 more seconds.
By the way, I got 3 more customers today.
I've only got 4 more minutes.
I've
only got 4 minutes left in this segment. And so what we'll do is after January, what we'll actually do this topic for a whole hour. Okay? So we'll do that. Let me throw this out. It's part of the mistake that we keep, as African Americans, we are having constant political discussions, but we simply don't control our own politics. Isn't it simply a question of if you do not have a strong economic base, yes, everything else is irrelevant?
That's correct. That's very true.
I don't know if everything else is irrelevant, but
I'm not saying it's irrelevant. If you ain't got your own money to control your situation, you swim upstream.
I think that's partially true. I think the other part of it is you're less likely to pay attention to your political power when you're just struggling to keep your lights on. I think that absolutely is the case. But I also think that it's high time for us to pay attention to both. We've always traditionally been able to crack open a little bit at least the political process a hell of a lot easier than we have the economic
Here's the challenge. Black folks are the only people in the world who only people in the world who created a political power base before an economic one. I'm not criticizing that. I'm saying that's
the only thing we could do. Oh, I didn't know that it was going to cause.
No.
Can you turn the lights off, please?
I like that.
We wanted to play this
That's good.
because we wanted to let the audience know. Yeah, let's give it up for Golden Martin. The reason we wanted to show this clip is because, one, the history of finance in the African descendant community is broad. We published an article just this week on the history of it. Took a brief glimpse at it. It was a 2,000-word article, 4 pages, way too much information for us to go through. So we thought that this clip really presented a nice condensed version of the history that's preceded what's happening right now with our current economic state. And so having set the tone with that clip, we wanted to pause it here because the look of frustration on Professor John Hope's, Brian's face is really, it encapsulates the tension that this conversation always comes to. We have those who say we should put all of our energy into politics. We have those who say we need to look at business development. We have those who say buying black won't accomplish much. And so tonight we have some experts who are going to help us hone in on this a little bit so we can see a bit more of what this debate should look like. Because when we think about that $1.2 trillion, just remember, the Mexican economy equates what we are currently producing and distributing and spending in our community. I'm not going to say distributing, I'm going to say spending in our community. So with that, we're going to bring our panelists to the screen. First up is Professor Roger Green, who is a former member of the New York State Assembly. He was elected to the New York legislative body for 25 years and represented the communities of Fort Greene, Crown Heights, Clinton Hill, Bed-Stuy, and Prospect Heights. Sworn into office in 1981 at the age of 28, and he was at that time the youngest elected official during that era. While in the State Assembly, he served for 3 terms, longest tenured chair of the New York State Black, Hispanic, and Asian Legislative Caucus. Citizen Green also chaired the Committee of Science and Technology, the Joint Budget Committee on Human Services, and is most proud of his work as chair of the Standing Committee on Children and Families, where he enacted laws reforming the juvenile justice system, family court system, child care, and family support services. Professor Green, thank you so much for being here. Attorney Steve Grant, who for the past 12 years has represented consumers in his private practice in the areas of credit and finance, foreclosure and debt collection defense, bankruptcy, landlord-tenant disputes, and unfair and deceptive business practices. Prior to his practice, he was a law clerk for the Honorable Judge Cornelius Blackshear. Mr. Grant is a member of the New York State Foreclosure Defense Bar, the Queens Bar Association, and the Metropolitan Lawyers Bar Association, and has also been active on the Brooklyn Bar's Volunteer Lawyers Project, participating in the Civil Legal Advice and Resource Office for Unrepresented Consumers in Foreclosure and Debt Collection Actions. Thank you so much for being with us, Mr. Grant. And finally, Molly Ornati, not least of all, and she is with the Bedford-Stuyvesant Restoration Corporation Financial Empowerment Center, where she serves as Associate Manager. She has more than 15 years of experience working in economic empowerment programs, both here in the U.S. and abroad. Ms. Ornati preceded this work by working at the Women's Business Center at the Business Outreach Center, packaging microloans, providing business startup training, and one-on-one counseling for small business entrepreneurs. Ms. Ornati, thank you so much for being here. And now to begin, we are going to actually, relieve us of looking at that poor man as he deals with the frustration, looking at the tensions between where we should put our energy. And we would like if each of the panelists could spend perhaps 3 to 5 minutes with some opening remarks, responding to what we just saw on the screen, and helping to shape your perspective on what we'll be discussing this evening. Professor Green, would you like to start?
Yeah, well, I think that what you saw was good. It's what we call a dialogical discourse, wherein you have 2 different viewpoints, but really, if you look at it, it's really contextualized into one form of reality in terms of the challenges that we face as a people with what I call the political economy. It's the 2 things. It's politics and policies that create the type of economy that we have within our communities. It's called political economy. And it is informed to a great extent in our society by a form of economy that we call capitalism. Today, we don't have a traditional form of capitalism that was articulated by people like Adam Smith in his magnum opus, Wealth of Nations. Today, we have a form of capitalism that most people would call predatory capitalism, casino capitalism, monopoly capitalism, and those forms of capitalism, I believe, have been destructive to communities of color. And what we need is a new form of economy. I don't know if you call it reform capitalism or whatever, wherein you address the question of wealth and broad-based profit sharing, which includes, I think, opportunities for to build wealth through worker cooperatives, union cooperatives, employee stock ownership programs, and probably also benefit corporations. So I thought that this was a great debate, which opens up a dialogue for us to start thinking about new ways of doing business within our community. Some of which I would also agree is inextricably linked to the history of how African American people survived coming out of bondage, in which we did what Dr. Boyce called economic innovations. So I'll talk about that later.
Thank you. Ms. Arnatti?
I think I'm a bit here more as a person that works as an implementer on the ground. We have a financial empowerment center at Bed-Stuy Restoration, and we're all about helping individuals on a one-on-one basis to strengthen their individual financial situation. And that kind of process is so vitally important because people don't get the information they need. It's a weakness in our education system. People need to learn about money from a really early age. There's sort of social taboos in families about talking about money, and that's something everyone needs to change. It needs to be a family conversation. Children can learn about savings from a really early age. And through our work, we really help people get small amounts of information. This is not really that complicated, but people don't have access to it. And it dramatically impacts their situation. We see about 2,000 clients a year. We have real measurable impacts in terms of decline in debt, increase in credit score, increase in savings, and we have a big impact in terms of decreasing in debt, about $5 million a year. In terms of an increase in debt, we have a lot less of an impact in terms of savings. And so that really points to different financial habits, and a lot of that point was addressed in the wonderful paper here by Ms. Favors that she sort of is the sort of framework of this conversation. And financial habits are really complicated, and how we can address them and how we can change them are really important. But like the conversation so far, it's the individual level and the larger cultural community level, and they're both important, and they completely interact, and things that are happening to an individual have this community impact, and that whole point, the wonderful point you raised about where the black dollar and where it's invested is such a dramatically important question that really hasn't been looked at in a really significant way. So I think it's so great that she's bringing that to the conversation here, and I think I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you. Mr. Grant?
I'm very pleased that I was invited to be here. I'm not quite sure why, but I think everybody who's here is interested in the topic, and there's almost everyone has something that they can say that can be helpful, and I think most people want to improve their wealth. They want to see their community improve, and if there's anything that comes out of this today, especially if I can contribute anything, then it will be worth your while. This is a great idea of all the people who put it together. I don't want to be too much like a politician and not answer the question that the favor asked. I will say that there was a debate that I read an argument back in the 80s about what really controls economics or politics. There were actually two articles. One insisted that it was economics that controls politics, and the author made a very convincing argument. By the time I finished reading, I was sure economics is what controls politics.
Right.
Then I read the next article, which argued just as convincingly that politics is what determines what economic systems are going to be used and how it's going to work out. And I realized that we're never going to be able to answer the question of whether it's economics or politics, because they are working together.
That's right.
A politician can make or encourage changes in economic policy that will have wide-ranging effects, but then again, sometimes economics will force politicians to come into line and create that reality. So we're going to see a lot of different factors working together. And when we watch that clip, where you stopped it, the person who was doing most of the talking, he had his own idea of what was, and he was putting up with these other ideas. But the thing is, they're both valid. The idea of credit scores is something I have some knowledge of. This fellow was talking about raising credit scores, and that's one area that I have some knowledge about, but I'm not sure how it's going to fit into this whole thing, so I'm going to wait for
We will definitely be addressing credit scores. But before we get there, we wanted to really set the historical context, right? A lot of times we'll hear this debate between which is worse, race or class, which causes the biggest divide, race and class. And at the Center for Law and Social Justice, we come from the historical perspective that says race was used to determine who had access to what class. When you determine that an entire group of people of one race, which is a man-made construct and actually is not reflected throughout actual society or beyond the thoughts that we bring to it, if you have one group of people who you assign one race, and then you say that that race is going to occupy the slave status, that's an economic decision, right? If we're saying that one group of people is going to be forced to work and not be compensated, that's an economic decision, and it's a redistribution of wealth vis-a-vis how we structure the economy. So that was really the first time that we see race and class being brought together, in that race was used to determine who had access to what class. That's where we start as it pertains to how our economy looks in this society. As we move forward, we know that with various housing programs, the government implemented programs like the Homesteading Act, which allowed pioneers to go west and invade land that was fully occupied, possess that land, and then establish homes. These were programs that were not available to African descendant people. We know that there were the GI Bill, and more recently, soldiers coming back from Vietnam wanting access to the government benefits that were set up for them that were going to help set up families. Those families and black soldiers were not allowed to have access to that information or access to those resources. When we think about the ways that government actively determines who has access to what wealth programs and who will not have access to those programs, how do you see that showing up in the work that you're doing today? How government policies are impacting the people that you interact with on a day-to-day basis?
Is that for me?
That's for you. And I'm going to say that for those of you who don't know, Mr. Grant is actually an expert consumer rights attorney, and that's why you're here. So yes, go ahead.
Well, okay, we'll run with it. Let me know if this is what you're talking about. We were just talking before about federal agencies. We have a new president, as you know. Every federal agency is actually part of the executive branch of government, and they answer to the president. That's an awful lot of power through regulations and what these agencies do that can affect every individual. There's a particular institution that's new, it was created under the Obama administration, the Consumer Financial Protection Board, that has broad powers to help consumers over all sorts of matters, student loans, banking matters. This agency, in my opinion, is phenomenal, and their ability to get results is phenomenal. This could all change very quickly under a new politics. The Congress could pass laws that would take away certain powers from this agency. The president can also influence policy, and I've seen it happen with other agencies. Administrations change, and agencies that help consumers with financial and consumer right matters, they become less responsive under certain agencies and more under different governing bodies, and it can have great effect. That's what I've seen so far.
And Ms. Ornati, what are you all seeing at the Financial Empowerment Center?
Well, I think what we're seeing at the Financial Empowerment Center is a result of so many different layers of political and economic processes. I think it's hard to break it down because they're so complex, but what the same bureau that you were speaking about, the corporation, the Consumer Federal Protection Board, came out with this study that you quote, which says that it would take 228 years at this rate for African Americans to catch up with white wealth. And
I'm sorry, could you say that just one more time? I don't think it resonated quite the way.
Yeah, it's quite stunning that it would take 228 years for African Americans to catch up with white wealth. And I think one of the big insights in this field of the past few years has been that while the income disparity between blacks and whites is like this, the assets disparity is like that. So really that the sort of focus on education, to get better jobs, to get better income, to try to close this gap is not sufficient. That because it's asset-based and because it's that inherited wealth that white people start with, that you're going to have greater, more aggressive investments to allow for that financial parity to occur. So it's about that the racial wealth gap is rooted more than anything in that asset difference. So it's which is mostly rooted in the home. The home is the primary source of wealth for Americans. And having a home that you can pass on, or having a home that you can sell and divide among 3 children so they can go to school, is what really is at the root of that financial disparity. So you're seeing that result in terms of what you're talking about, sort of the broader political picture and the individual picture that you see on a daily basis. And I think that's a really important insight that people hadn't really gotten to before. And the question of how do you address what kind of structural changes are needed to address these issues is really the question. And I think the arguments of the organization that came up with that 228 years, their conclusion was that unless there is the racial wealth divide lens brought to every aspect of government, it will not be addressed. So in other words, that it's so entrenched in the tax code, in education, in so many layers of society, that should be the audit through which all government programs should be evaluated.
Now I want us to think for a minute, what was happening 228 years ago that locked up black wealth such that we are now 228 years behind our white counterparts? Okay, so when we talk about how a lot of us are not comfortable talking about slavery, a lot of us are not comfortable seeing how that interplays and interacts with us today, but if we're 228 years behind our white counterparts as it pertains to asset and wealth development, What was happening 228 years ago that prohibited us from being able to tap into the wealth and resources that we naturally possess, right? When we're talking about the fact that race, as you mentioned, Mr. Arnadi, a racial lens needs to be explicitly applied to our finances, to our education systems, to our housing, because as you mentioned, wealth is often, for many of us, tied up in our homes. And yet we know that in the 2008 financial crisis, African American and Latin American communities lost over 50% of our wealth because most of our wealth was tied up in homes. We were then exposed to mortgages and foreclosures that white communities were not exposed to, and as a result, most of that wealth buildup has been eviscerated, right? And so when we talk about how race impacts our wallet, we're talking a lot of dollars and cents, and we're looking at very concrete impacts. Professor Green, you have a lot of background in looking at how that history impacts us today. From a professorial perspective, what do you think is one of the largest contributors to our current financial situation in the African descendant community?
Well, I think, again, it is historical. And you mentioned the original 1862 Homesteaders Act, which really, there was two things that were occurring. Two communities of color were impacted by that process. One was the Homesteaders Act was built on what was called the Indian Removal Act, which took the original people of color off of land that they control, which now comprises close to 10% of the total land mass in the United States. And that land that they were removed from was then transferred into the hands of white settlers who used it for slave plantations. And that contributes to, in fact, the wealth formation or asset aggregation that some families still have to this day. Then you talked about the Federal Housing Deposit Association, the FDHA. There again, my father came out of World War II as a soldier who was fighting Hitler-right fascism, which was against racism of another sort. And he came back, and he had a GI Bill, but it had racial covenants in there, which indicated that he could not purchase homes within certain areas, nor even if he purchased a home in an area that was predominated by black people or people of color, could he get a home improvement loan. And that was written into the law. This was public policies as part of the political economy. It was orchestrated by what's called the Jim Crow regime, which were white supremacists who actually were elected to the Congress of the United States. So all these things have contributed to what we see as the asset disparities that exist. And now, after the financial crisis in 2007, it has gotten much worse. Because as you said earlier, how, it's one thing, number one, our homes, families depend on income, but the real driver for the inequalities that exist within our economy is the asset aggregation that has occurred in the hands of what some folks call the one percenters. Some folks call them the economic royalists of this era. And that's driving the real asset disparities that we see. And so, going back to the issue of, what you said earlier, it is both politics and economics. And that's what we call it the political economy. The politicians are in a position in Congress, in the executive branch of the White House. Decisions are made by the members of the Supreme Court, all related to the regulation of the economy. And how it's regulated has a direct impact on whether or not you're going to accumulate more assets within your lifetime that you can then transfer over to your children, and that's called generational wealth. And so these things don't come about through osmosis. These are intentional policies that are written into law, and I served in Albany for 25 years, and I saw what occurs. My personal experience in terms of starting to explore these issues grew out of conversations that I had in part with students at Meg Evans College, where often young folks and students would say, talk about our community and be concerned about concepts like black-on-black crime and where did it come from, and why are we the way that we are. And a lot of it was really a reflection of a kind of internalized despair without looking at the full picture in terms of how external forces can have an impact on a people's lives. Finally, one anecdotal story, which gets me into the whole issue about building health and building wealth in communities as an issue. When I was serving in the state legislature, I had an opportunity to create a law to create a children's psychiatric hospital in central Brooklyn. I had been petitioned by parents who wanted a children's psychiatric hospital when I was serving as chair of the Committee on Children and Families, and I thought they were right, because our children were being sent to Staten Island. And so, after 6 years, finally got the bill enacted into law, and then we had a groundbreaking ceremony after the children entered the facility. $57 million in Brownsville. Beautiful complex, swimming pool we put in there, classrooms, beds. I mean, it was just an incredible facility. So as I'm leaving, my chief of staff and I asked the medical director, said, how's things going? Of course, I had my peacocking, had my chest poked out, you know, people, you know, they're taking cameras and, you know, writing newspaper articles. But I asked the medical director, I said, so, how are the children doing? And basically said, well, they're doing okay, but we have one problem. I said, we have a problem? What could that be? They don't want to return to their communities. They wanted to stay in the children's psychiatric hospital because of the conditions in their community. And that was, for me, an epiphany, which began my whole kind of intellectual curiosity around the relationship between health and wealth. And then learned that there's a term that comes up called the social determinants of health, which is now a body of knowledge and discipline in the social sciences that looks at the relationship between wealth and health. Wealth and health. Now, closing saying this, what we're looking at is you have, in New York City, the largest industry in Brooklyn is the healthcare industry. Largest industry in the city of New York is healthcare, but mostly concentrated in Brooklyn and the Bronx, where is the largest concentration of poverty in New York City. The healthcare industry, which is regulated by the elected officials, appropriates $50 billion per year. I said $50 billion per year between the nonprofit healthcare sector and the Health and Hospitals Corporation. None of that money, because it's not regulated to go back into our local economy to build wealth, to build generational wealth, is occurring. That's the political economy. Hear what I'm saying? You know, so in this era, you know, with the big elephant in the room tonight, you know what's happening in D.C. Timely that Center for Law and Social Justice, I have to thank them from the depths of my heart for having the vision to bring us here to start talking about the type of proactive agendas that we need to become engaged in to create a different kind of political economy so that we can build generational wealth within our lifetime. So that's what I have to say.
And thank you for sharing that. Here's actually a brief example of what Professor Green is talking about in real practice. And this is taken from the book Black Wealth, White Wealth by Dr. Michael Oliver. And Dr. Oliver says that African Americans either could not get loans from the FHA, Federal Housing Association, or when they did get loans, they were consigned to inner city neighborhoods, meaning you have a loan to buy a house, but your house has to be in the hood, right? Not a problem if you have a financial economic base in the hood. You want to be there, but if you wanted to leave, you were restricted, as you mentioned, by some of the covenants that were employed therein. Which means that in the 1970s, the average white family could purchase a home within a suburban tract. They had no money down payments. They had an FHA loan that cost less for mortgage, taxes, and utilities than a comparable apartment in the inner city. 30 years later, they might have $250,000 in equity because that home has increased in value. So I want to think about the 1970s. I want to fast forward to the 2000s, which is approximately 30 years later. So 1970s, I am technically a 70s baby, which is why I missed being a millennial by a year and a half, right? So the time I'm born, I'm born in an era that is closing out, but not fully, restrictions on African descendant people from being able to take their financial wherewithal to whichever neighborhood they wanted to live in, were barred by the terms within the loans themselves. Think about the white family that's able to purchase a loan in 1975, 76, 77, 80, 82, 84, when there were still recurring impacts from this type of systematic racism. That family now, $250,000 in equity later, perhaps in Bed-Stuy, where most of us can't afford to buy, perhaps in Fort Greene, where most of us can't afford to buy, perhaps in neighborhoods right now that are rapidly gentrifying near you. I want us to think about how government policies, institutional racism, dovetail to restrict the access of black people to capital, to resources, and then determines how we spend what it is that we spend. And I actually want to shift a little bit now, because we've explored a bit about that history. We've seen, I think, sufficiently how racism interplays with governmental policy to impact our access to resources. But then we get resources. Some of us have access to capital, some of us have access to jobs. We are able to bring in money and resources wherever we can. And some of our personal spending habits are further contributing to this type of inequity within our community. One of the things that Dr. Joy DeGruy, who is the author of Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome, a phenomenal book I highly recommend for everyone to read, she writes that she remembers seeing on television show, a show that featured the homes and cars of famous wealthy individuals. One young black gentleman, she writes, toured the audience through a sea of his stuff to elaborate his numerous cars, including his favorite, which was a mink-lined Bentley. Yet he was not yet old enough to actually drive. She goes on to say that people who believe themselves to have little worth, little power, little self-efficacy will often do whatever they can to don the trappings of power. And this term is now referred to often as conspicuous consumption. Conspicuous consumption is, I may be poor, I may not be, but you are going to know how much money I want you to think that I have by the way I wear it, by the things that I purchase, by the way I display my wealth in front of you, right? So, Mr. Grant, as a consumer rights attorney, when I was in private practice, you were actually one of the attorneys I would come to with these horror stories. I was in private practice as a bankruptcy attorney. I remember one client who had 40 Gucci bags, Prada bags, Louis bags, literally enough money in her closet to fund private school education for her child for several years, preparing to file bankruptcy. I know you have some of the horror stories. We have tossed these stories back and forth, and we've seen them. How does a feeling or lack of a sense of self-worth, how does that show up in your clients? How does conspicuous consumption and the need to show one is valuable show up in the client population that you reach?
You're coming up with some zingers. In any case, I'll try to keep within the context. Since one of the areas that I do is bankruptcy, people think of that as the bottom of the barrel, but actually, if you're really poor, you don't need bankruptcy, because bankruptcy protects what you have, and the people with the least amount we consider judgment-proof, meaning there's nothing that you can get from them. The anecdote about the person with expensive possessions filing bankruptcy, they're going to have a problem, of course, in bankruptcy, because you don't get to necessarily keep your valuable possessions with the type of bankruptcy most people would think of. But one of the reasons people end up filing bankruptcy, or the reason I've seen the most, has to do with their spending credit cards. That's one of the main contributors. When it gets to the point that people are using credit cards to pay for their food and groceries, and not just Gucci bags, then that's a whole nother level. But the fact that you have easy access to credit, you can't win with credit cards, and more than anything else, that's what brings people to the stage where they're trying to file bankruptcy. They're trying to keep what little they have. Now, let's see if I can actually answer your questions. I'm talking, but I don't know if we're really...
Well, and perhaps maybe you could share with us some of the things that you've seen on the not legal side, but perhaps some of the conversations that you have had, obviously respecting attorney-client privilege, but some of the things that seem to come up reoccurring, some of the emotions that people seem to possess when they are in that financial state. What are some of the things that they're thinking about? What are some of the things
There's
that
definitely emotions. Most people who come to file bankruptcy or foreclosure defense, they feel that they've done things wrong. They have to be assured that this is not necessarily all their fault. I usually say it's not your fault because the institutions are set up in a way to make people fail in this way, like the credit cards, the loans, the foreclosure loans. These were bad loans. They were seen as attractive at the time, but they had rates that would keep going up. They had other conditions. So people didn't know what they were signing into, and people have to be reassured that they are good people and that they are smart people and they can get over this. And it's not all they're doing. I'm not going to say they have no responsibility, but it's not all their fault.
And Mr. Arnadi, what about in the clientele that you service?
Well, I mean, I think financial institutions are predatory, and with the housing crisis and the tremendous impact that had, that's really shocking. I mean, that's really a story of plunder. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's really incredible. But people need to know how to navigate the financial system. A lot of every day I talk to people about their credit cards. Do they know what the interest rate is? Often they don't. People often don't know how interest works. People, I think the culture that we're in of sort of everything with credit card, everything is plastic, it doesn't feel real. People are not aware of the cash that they're spending. And so our work a lot is about sort of getting people to just like stop for a second, look at their budget, look at the totality of their financial situation, and it's really helpful. I mean, financial counseling is something that every single person can benefit from. And people sometimes have an idea, well, I'm not working, so I don't need it, or I'm not making that much money, so I don't need it. But really, it's a really important thing, especially in this culture where you're supposed to be an expert on certain financial things, whether you studied that or not. I mean, everyone's retirement plan is invested, and people don't know what their retirement plans are invested in. They don't know how to look at their investments. So this is a kind of basic information that everybody at this point is required to learn, but doesn't have the access to that process. So that's where everyone has to be more proactive and more aggressively out for themselves, so they can be more have more of a defensive strategy instead of being more the prey of predatory financial practices, which are all around us, and a culture that's all around us, constantly telling us to spend, constantly telling us, you're not beautiful, you're not sexy, you're not this, you're not that, unless you buy this item. And that's preying on our minds. I mean, it's a very powerful psychological thing. It's a really complex part of it. Yeah. But
we know that's being
those
promoted.
factors are in play.
Right, and we know that those messages are being promoted to our nation writ large. And we are all pummeled with messages that said, buy now, buy now, buy now. And Kanye West actually wrote about this in one of his earlier albums when he wrote All Falls Down. He says, we buy our way out of jail, but we can't buy freedom. We buy a lot of clothes, we don't really need them. Things we buy to cover up what's inside because they make us hate ourselves and love it. Well, I mean, the brother was talking about a whole lot of things he's experiencing right now. But at that time, that was pivotal because it really held up an image for a lot of us who sort of participate in this economy of buy, 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 buy. And for those of us in the African descendant community, when you are also pummeled with messaging that says you're inferior, When you're also pummeled with messaging that says you are less than. If you're this shade of brown, you're extra less than. If your hair is this shade of nappy, you're even more less than. So when you have all of that messaging on top of a consumer society that says you must buy in order to establish that you have value as a human being, you are going to experience conspicuous consumption in a much more extreme way. So this is something that is impacting our nation, but it is having a particular impact in the African descendant community. Professor Reed, were you?
Yeah, I think it's, so the etymology of the word, or word history, for economics is really aligned with the ancients called moral philosophy. You know, the study of economics is really about moral philosophy, which is about values. So, in the African continent, there's a growing out of the work of Julius Nyerere, who used to serve as the president of Tanzania. He used the term ujamaa, which meant cooperative economics, and created a political economy that would focus on the concept of cooperative economics, which is a different kind of value.
That's right.
You know, it's about mutualism, and in many cases it's about democratic practice, even within the context of the business institutions that you're working within, the economic institutions that you're working in. And it's a lot different than predatory capitalism, or even the old classical models of classic capitalism that was once when we talked about free markets, which we don't have now. You know, monopoly capitalism is not free markets, neither is casino capitalism. So what I suggest is we look at this in the context of moral philosophy. You know, here's a quote from Dr. Du Bois, who did a lot of work. In fact, in 1907, at Atlanta University, he started a series of, just like you're doing here, I want to thank you again, a series of conferences that was dedicated to looking at what he called economic innovations, and he focused on cooperative economics. And he said, should we go the way of capitalism and try to become individually rich as capitalists, or should we go the way of cooperative economics and economic cooperation where we and our whole community can be rich together? That's a different definition of wealth. About a year and a half ago, I had an opportunity to travel to Spain, to Mondragon, the area of Spain, where they have the largest working cooperative on the planet. When the financial markets collapsed in the United States, it had an impact on the European community also. Recession, in some areas, economic depression hit as well. The one area of Europe that it didn't hit was in Mondragon, because it was organized in a way with what they call economic solidarity, where, as opposed to allowing workers to lose their jobs and then that creating a crisis in their local community, they formulated a policy that would reintegrate those workers back within their respective ecosystem, economic ecosystem, even though they took a minimum reduction in wages. But when you went to Mondragon, I saw no homeless people. I saw people, they didn't have Benzes and Bentleys, but they were living well, and they were healthy. They have one of the healthiest economies, and also in terms of life expectancy, one of the longest life expectancies on the European community. All right? And so went there with some labor leaders, and we came back, and then there was a serious discussion about we have to start looking at this in the context of the type of values that we're pushing within our community also. You know? And so what I think is that we have to look at this in the context of moral philosophy and politics, but then start looking at maybe, just as we have worked on political democracy, we now need to start looking at a program for economic democracy, meaning broad-based profit sharing within our community, that reduces the asset disparities that we currently see that are strangling the African American Latino communities. The pay ratio between the corporate execs is like 400 to 1 in the United States. In Mondragon, it's 6 to 1. Think about that. In the United States, it's growing. In some parts of the economic sector, it's 1,000 to 1. Oxfam just came out with a report indicating that there's 14 families on the planet that controls more than 40% of the world's assets and capital. Now we look at who got elected president, the cabinet that he's putting around him, billionaires here, billionaires over the education system, billionaires over there. Yo, we need this kind of dialogue to start talking about how we organize within ourselves and building on our tradition, because the concept of worker cooperatives, that Dr. Du Bois talked about, is something that we have a tradition in doing. Fannie Lou Hamer, Ella Baker, all of those folks integrated their politics with worker co-ops. And so that's what I think we need to begin to look at.
May I start a little prep here?
Go ahead.
I heard you mention profit sharing. How far can that go before people start talking about socialism, and then you said a bad word and start a whole set of emotions?
I think that's a good question. I don't use the term socialism. I use the term economic democracy. I think we need to put democracy into our political institutions, democratize the economy. That's what I say. And if you look at even what some of the framers of the Constitution talked about, Thomas Jefferson talked about this. He wanted within the Constitution. Now, he owned slaves, so I got issues with that. But he wanted a provision in the Constitution that was opposed to monopoly formulation. And then he and Adams and several other framers talked about why there should be wide distribution of property, unlike what was happening in England, the concentration of property in a handful of economic royalists between the crown and the aristocracy. They didn't want that. They got that right, but they only got it right for white males, all right? What we're saying is that what has happened is that there's been a perversion of the American ideal about widespread property, which they did for white settlers. We need to take the same concept and expand it for the new demographics that are existing in the country today. If they didn't call it socialism to give out land in the West, land distribution of property, they didn't call that socialism. We need community land trusts in our community so that we can fight back population displacement, and I don't call it gentrification. I think that's too kind. It's actually pervasive resegregation of certain neighborhoods.
So this is actually a perfect segue, and the reason I switched back to this slide is that I want us to remember that currently black buying power at $1.2 trillion a year, which puts us on par with the entire economy or the GDP of Mexico, an entire self-sufficient and wholly owned nation. Now, we spoke again earlier about the fact that black-owned businesses are only getting 2% of that $1.2 trillion. However, if, and this is going to speak to the values that you just mentioned, if our values were collected, and this is going to be taken, this brief passage is from a book by Maggie Anderson, Our Black Year, One Family's Quest to Buy Black in America's Racially Divided Economy. There was a study done by the Kellogg School, which was looking at black buying and black spending, and they said that if black households with a sustainable income of $75,000 would increase our spending from 2 pennies out of every dollar to just 10 pennies out of every dollar, we could generate $14 billion in revenue targeting black-owned businesses. She then breaks down further that that $14 billion in revenue could start over 200,000 Subway sandwich shops, which employ 8 to 11 people each, which would generate income for an entire masses of people. Now, not to suggest that everyone wants to work in Subway, but this is one example about what 2 pennies out of every dollar being intentionally targeted at a black business could do. If we were to increase that spending and shift our values such that, or refocus our values such that as opposed to focusing on conspicuous spending and bling, we were thinking more about employing our own people, we would be able to do so without requiring outside intervention. And we don't have to call it socialism, we can call it Williamsburg. What's happening? See what's happening in Williamsburg. In Williamsburg, let us be clear, that community circulates their money.
That's right.
They can get paid from someone who looks like them. They can go into shops owned by people who look like them, who worship with them. They can spend that money for weeks without that money ever having to leave the community.
Mutualism.
Yes, mutualism. We can add any word to it. I like Williamsburg just because we all know exactly what I mean when I say that. But if we were to think about the potential that we have with our dollars,
That's right.
we were to think about the potential, and one of the reasons we wanted to have this conversation is because what history tells us, and the reason we spend time on that history, is that our government is very clear about who they want to generate income for and wealth for and who they do not. We have no reason historically to believe that that is going to change. In fact, we now, as of today, have every reason to think it is going to continue and it's going to accelerate. If we know that history tells us we cannot rely on outside government forces to funnel resources and economy boosters into the black community, who else can we look to but ourselves and shifting our own values?
That's
So
right.
having said that, what are some of the solutions that we could begin employing? You mentioned the cooperatives and some of the land trusts that you saw in Spain, and again, remembering that Europe was hit extraordinarily hard by the crisis, so to know that the enclave or the oasis of financial independence was in this space where Ujamaa, cooperative economics, was the name of the game, that is significant for us who come from a community that tends to be collective in nature. So what are some of the ways that as individuals, I'm not talking about marches, I'm not talking about protests, I'm not talking about mass actions, what are some of the ways that individual people within this community can begin shifting their decisions so that we are thinking more about collective economic engagement? And that's for anybody.
Well, I want to go back to the example, let's say Williamsburg, if we can just say Williamsburg, and the cohesiveness, perhaps, or the cooperation of that community. How do we, where do we find an example of what we call black people or people of color? Where do we find an example of that type of cohesiveness and thought process or institutional process? Because it's more than just Professor Green and me saying, you know, people need to get together. Because we've been hearing that for as long as we've been around. And it doesn't happen in that way. And we have to understand what the reasons are.
That's right.
So we all should go through what we call experiential learning. You know, what's on the streets, what we study. You know, we all need to do that. That's how, in part, how we're going to transform our communities. So I want to recommend a book. Jessica Gordon-Nimhard, professor at John Jay, has a book called Collective Courage, History of African American Cooperative Economic Thought and Practice. And it talks about that coming out of bondage, we began creating different types of cooperative economic institutions and programs. The African burial ground system, not the African burial societies, I'm sorry, were part of that, where that launched our insurance companies. African burial societies, yeah, launched out, you know, a number of our insurance companies, pulling monies together like folks do today through the SUSUs, but using it not for their individual purposes, but to build businesses and institutions.
I just want to pause you right there. Is everyone familiar with what he means when he says susus?
I know they are.
All right. I just
Yeah.
For the people who are online,
I know what audience I'm talking to.
well, for the people who are online, could you briefly explain what a susu is? Just 30 seconds on that, just so we're clear.
Well, it's a model in which people pull their monies together over, let's say, my wife is in a susu. So she puts money into a pot, and then within the next month, everybody accumulates a certain pot of money, and she gets her own investment back, and it accumulates over time. There are, in fact, some places on the African continent where the women are using that to build their businesses, all right? They're doing that in some parts of the Caribbean as well. That's an African tradition that speaks to the principle of mutualism and a form of cooperative economics. Well, that's what African people did coming out of bondage in the United States to build the burial societies, because they needed to bury their people, their family members. And then they built on that to create the insurance companies, right? And so you have this value system again that focuses on that. You know, it's not rugged individualism. You know, it's about mutualism and cooperation. So this book, I would recommend it, Collective Courage: A History of African American Cooperative Economics and Thought. In contemporary time, it's Jessica Gordon Nimhart. She's at John Jay, and the book is called Collective Courage: A History of African American Cooperative Economic Thought and Practice. And in it, you'll also find, in contemporary times, who's doing this type of work. So right here in New York City, the largest worker cooperative is Cooperative Home Care Associates, which is predominated by African American and Latino women who primarily live in the Bronx. That's the largest cooperative in the United States. And it's a cooperative that's organized in collaboration with 1199 SEIU, right, which is a union. There are other new cooperative models that are going on nationally. The United Steelworkers, working with a group mostly of African American and people of color, to build industrial appliances through a unionized worker cooperative, which is then having contracts with the healthcare industry in Cleveland. Here, and I'm closing this, here in Brooklyn, we anticipate that, we hope, within the next 12 months, working with the unions, we will have at least 3 to 4 union worker cooperatives initiated here in Brooklyn. One, which will be an urban farm, organized by young African American men here in Brooklyn, hopefully aligned with Meg Evans College, to create produce that will then be sold to the healthcare industry. You hear what I'm saying? You know, folks go into the hospitals, they need food, and they should have healthy food. Who's producing that? So that changes the supply chain, where that $50 billion is being redirected into our community through what we're going to call health enterprise zones to build health and wealth. You know what I'm saying? So that's a concept. Another concept that we're talking about is the use of community health workers in the context of unionized worker cooperatives, the building of furniture for the healthcare industry, beds, other kinds of supplies that should be organized locally in innovative economic institutions. And then you create a system of profit sharing that allows for economic democracy within these businesses and these institutions. And that's how you can begin to close the gap between the rich and the poor, you know, addressing crisis of the working poor and the poor within communities of color. That's what I think. And I mean, this is what we're going to try.
So you're talking not just about empowering one person, but this is a different approach at looking at how income is gathered, how products are manufactured, how it's distributed, and really tying in both ends of that economic chain.
Yeah, and it's called, we're calling it the Central Brooklyn Commonwealth Initiative. You understand what I'm here to tell you?
Write that down.
Central Brooklyn Commonwealth, you know. And it grows out of, quite honestly, again, when you go back to the concept of moral philosophy, when the ancients and even the people during the Enlightenment period talked about the concept of an economy, they didn't always talk about it in the context of what's called the closure. You know, that came about later. The concept that you're going to have property that's enclosed and controlled by one individual. And that was really done to really remove power away from the peasants so that the aristocracy could control the the lives of the people and create a master-servant relationship. That's the history. And you see that same master-servant relationship morphing into chattel slavery.
That's right.
Started with indentured servitude for white folks in Europe, and then it became racialized to create chattel slavery in the United States and other parts of the globe. And that's a master-servant relationship that didn't used to exist within the human family. And so we're saying that we need to go back to certain values that looks at concepts of mutualism, cooperation as part of a new type of moral philosophy, and that we call economic democracy.
Now, Mr. Arnott, you actually worked with microlending and different forms of finance on an international scale. For the audience, what is microlending? How are people throughout the world using microlending to meet the need when traditional Western forms of economy are not meeting the need?
Yeah, microfinance is almost a movement, international process that's going on to address poverty. And it's about what Mr. Green has been talking about. It's about groups of women saving, like in a susu. They put their money together and they lend to each other. They and part of what's so exciting about it is that in this process, when they come together, they hold each other accountable so they are consistent with their savings. But then out of this, a wonderful sort of social safety net develops, so that when somebody's husband dies, they are all together, and the bonds grow, and they sort of, when they go through the process and the first time they share out their money and they see what they've saved and they see how effective it is, they become that much more committed. And then they go on, continue to lend to each other, and then they might decide to build a school, or they might decide to hire a health worker, and it's really phenomenally effective. There's someone named Muhammad Yunus who was the original founder,
Right.
and he won the Nobel Prize. It's a movement that's actually been sort of started in the 70s. And we have it in this country. There's several organizations in New York City. One's called Action, one's called Grameen Bank, and it's to help people that just need that little startup capital. When you're doing it in the developing world, that startup capital to buy a pig, to buy a cow, is a lot less than in New York City, the kind of startup capital you need. So it's more difficult, but the principle is the same, and it's about on-lending, about solidarity lending. And it's really, it's just amazing how effective it is. It really works so well because of that, I think in part because of that added component, that people become socially connected, and,
That's right.
and that is a sort of reinforcement in people's lives. You know, in this country we're all so atomized, everybody's on their own, it's
That's
so dog-eat-dog world, you know, everybody has to defend for themselves. Whereas this is a collective consciousness, which is such a more evolved sort of approach
That's right.
to living, I think, because it's really about the collective good, and that you vote with your dollar and you vote on your community, and you make a statement in your spending, and we're all voting with our dollars, and we're voting for corporations most of the time, and we're voting for name brands, and we're voting against our interest for the most
Now,
part.
by a show of hands in the audience, how many of you, listen to the question carefully, this is not about you, how many of you know someone else who has been denied a bank loan? By a show of hands. Okay, I'm gonna raise my hand too. How many of you, this is not about you, how many of you know someone else who has been rejected for credit offers, for things that they actually needed, right? Okay, now, how many of you, maybe you, know of people who participate in a susu? I want you to recognize that it was about the same amount of hands each time. We all know someone who's been rejected from a bank loan. We all know someone who's been rejected from access to credit and capital. And yet we all know people who are participating in SUSUs and other forms of economy. If we start with the question that you raised, Attorney Grant, where you're saying, it's great to say, I black, support the community, spending, but for some reason we're not doing that. And yet we have these examples where we actually, in some ways, are servicing each other and helping to meet financial needs. And we know that internationally, others are using these same tools to not just pay their personal affairs, but to start businesses and to get the investment capital they need to then go on and start businesses. We've just identified problem and potential solutions, right? So the problem being we don't have access to banking and financing services the way we would like, but we do have access to SUSUs and culturally responsive economic exchange systems that we knew back home. Some of us knew them down south, and we bring them here, and we use them often with our girlfriends, often with our families, but we don't necessarily use them with an eye towards purchasing a home for the block. We don't necessarily use them with an eye towards 5 families getting together and buying up 2 brownstones so that they can pass that generational wealth down. We don't think about it in ways of entrepreneurs pooling their money so that this quarter, this entrepreneur gets her loan so she can open up her business, that one gets his the next quarter. We don't often think about our indigenous and organic practices as solutions that could lead us out of the current situation that we have. So I wanted to highlight that because I think it's important. We all know people on both sides of this scale. We all know of active solutions we could be employing now, but we need to marry that solution to what's actually happening in our community. Does that make sense, y'all? Yes, ma'am. Okay, good. So we're coming down to the close. If you have some questions, and I do want to say that we are going to have a question and answer session. We are not, unfortunately, going to have time for another panel. So if you have a panelist type of discourse, or if you want to make a speech, this would not be the appropriate time for you. But if you have a question for our panelists, we encourage you to come to the mic here. We're going to have a few minutes for question and answer, and then afterwards everyone will be available for further discussion. But as we're thinking more with an eye towards solutions, what are some of the things that you would like to see in the day-to-day practice of the community? What are some things that you think, if we were to shift these 1 or 2 things, could have some incremental snowball effects towards really helping us solve the problems that we find ourselves in? That can be for anybody.
Well, one thing I'd like to see more of is investment groups, like friends getting together and actually discussing investments and putting their money together. I've actually talked to people about it and even joined other people's attempts to get these things started, but it seems like they usually get stalled, usually around the time that you ask, is everybody got money to contribute? That's when all of a sudden things start falling apart. But I'd like to see more of that, and I guess more information and encouragement from people who are succeeding with their investment groups.
I'd like to see an end of social welfare colonialism. What I mean by that is we have institutions that you and I as taxpayers are funding, and we have no control over them. And a prime example being many of our hospitals and medical centers. 87% of all of the resources going into our hospitals come from you and I, the taxpayers. But those hospitals are run and managed by healthcare plutocrats who don't live in our community, but are engaged in the process of exploitation and extraction of resources that are taken out of our community. And so that's an issue of politics. You know, no taxation without representation. You heard that before, right? We need a movement to gain control of those institutions, maybe a community labor movement that says we control it from the board to who's the directors, but also to reorganize the institutions so that they reflect, again, economic democracy, both in terms of the workplace, who has access to the supply chains, the purchasing, and of course, most importantly, the delivery of services to our patients and the larger community. But that's an example of what's happening, I think, in our community. Social welfare colonialism, all right? And so I think that we could do that. The second thing is it's about education and pedagogy. So one of the reasons that we talk about this whole concept of rugged individualism is the only way to survive is because we're taught that way.
Thank you.
And so here at Mega, we have a school of business. What we're now trying to do is to create a program that will teach people the concept of the management of cooperative enterprises, to create space for those folks who want to go a different way, want to make a living, want to make a decent living, want to create generational wealth, but also to share it in what you folks used to call the common good, the commons, you know, not just for us as individuals, because at the end of the day, like Dr. King said, you know, the notion that we can survive not being inextricably connected to each other is insane, you know? I don't want to live in a community where I got a nice house and a few blocks down the street, folks are living in poverty and they're going to be preying on me. That's alienation. So we need a different model, and I think we begin by changing epistemology and pedagogy in the schools to begin teaching a different kind of value system that needs to be implanted in our political economy, a different type of moral philosophy, Ujamaa.
Okay, thank you. Yes, first question.
Good evening. My name is Diane Daly, and we have a trade association in the industry, and I want to know...
Which industry?
Natural hair and beauty industry. It's called Emerge. It's Natural Hair Beauty Industry Alliance. It's a trade network we're developing, and one of the things we were talking about was collective economics and investment in a group. How can I start my members in that process, in a collective savings as a trade association, so that we can buy collectively? Because one of the things that we believe in, and one of the things that we say, is there is power within community. So we have a community, a very large community, but how can I talk to my professional stylists and barbers to become a part of an economic collective? What are the steps I need to take?
I guess the first step is finding out who's interested, and if there's...
Well, I have people who are interested, but do I start with a bank account? Do we do a susu and then put that money somewhere? Is it under an LLC, or is it separate from the LLC? How do you manage that as a trade network, or a trade association?
Well, if there is agreement to create an investment group, that means everybody is going to agree that the money is pooled together. It can be an entity or a bank. Would be the easiest way to me, because I know how that works. An account with a name and authorized signers who are trusted. Now, as far as how to maximize the money, that's probably beyond the scope of my knowledge and this
Right, so you're suggesting that we put the money into an account, or everyone puts money into an account, and then that money is circulated from individual or business to business?
Well, it's put in an account with a purpose to either leave it in the account if the return is good enough with that amount of money, or to figure out how to maximize it with other types of investments. But that's beyond me right now.
I need a consultation.
That's exactly what we want to happen. And it's important that we recognize there are different business formats that can help you with your investment structures. Obviously, we can't give individualized advice about what structure would be best for you. But if you have a group of friends and you all want to purchase a building, yeah, you could do it on a handshake. If you're not comfortable with a handshake, you could write down a contract. You could write down an agreement that says, we agree we're going to buy this house. Each person is going to put in this much money. If we don't want to be a part of this home ownership anymore, this is how we get out of this deal. All of these things can be structured in a way that can be thoughtful, pragmatic and applicable to the needs of your particular group. So that was a great question, Ms. Bailey, and we are definitely going to be excited about seeing this trade association continue.
The only thing I would add to that is, I think it's a great question, and basically what you're thinking through is what Warren Buffett did when he got started. He started off as an investment club.
That's right.
With his family and close friends, and now he's one of the wealthiest people on the planet. So you're moving in the right direction.
And I always say the hardest thing to do is to love a people who are taught to hate themselves. So when you're dealing with a racialized approach to economics, it's important that you're hitting that with education, articles that you all are circulating, and really changing the dialogue within that group so that you're able to be wiser in your decision making.
That's right.
Yes.
How you doing? So my question is probably going to be kind of broad. The first thing I would say is I think many times when we sort of anthropomorphize institutions as being sort of intentionally evil, it can discourage people from participating in those institutions. So I feel that sometimes when we talk about systems being evil or being sort of like having this sort of like boogeyman sort of persona, I think that can work towards people not participating in certain institutions, and so they, sort of being disillusioned. And so that kind of sets up my other question is, apart from apart from the sort of, I guess, these classes that you were talking about, Professor Green, of creating a culture in which we see things like susus as being something as real things that we can be a part of.
Yeah.
I guess what other ways can we sort of change this culture of since we are born in such a we're socialized to be so to think about our wealth as being so individual. How do you then bring that, like whether it's through social media or whatever? How do you bring? I mean, we're talking about New York that has a black population that's pretty educated and is more cohesive. And when you travel outside of our communities or outside of New York, how do you then transfer that feeling or that sense of unity to people that are so indoctrinated to having this individualized sense of themselves and wealth and not seeing not thinking about me and thinking about us? I guess that's a
good question. First of all, I think there are some really serious and deliberative progressive pockets outside of New York City also that I've studied and I've learned from. And I don't feel that work that we're doing here represents that we have any proprietorship on any kind of progressive ideas, because I see it all over the planet, quite honestly. I learned from that. Having said that, the key, I think, is to link theory with application. In the context as an educator, what I look at is if you just stick with theory, that's all it's going to be. So we need an educational system that links theory with application and experiential education, because that's what really changes culture and inspires people to say, okay, I got this. So here's an example. So we're talking about this urban farming system that we want to produce produce for the healthcare system. So we want to start early. So in hydroponics and aquaponics is the growing of green leaf vegetables and fish in water. You know that, right? But you can learn biology, chemistry, and physics by doing this work. And then if you add a business component to it that's based upon worker cooperatives, the young folks will begin to see it's not just theoretical for me to go in and learn how to grow green leaf vegetables. Now I have an alternative to slinging rocks on the corner.
You know what?
And let me say this.
No.
And then it goes back to what you're saying. If you link that to a micro enterprise where a portion of the profits that they're making is being placed in either a prepaid tuition trust fund or an IDA, individual development account, see, then it becomes concrete that the knowledge that they're internalizing and applying for the business that they're dealing with is creating generational wealth for themselves and their families to get a better education, maybe to start up a new business within their communities. You know, so it's really about, I think, I always think about education, the issue of linking theory to application also with new values, you know. And I think, I'm not saying it's going to be perfect, you know, and we may not, you know, change the whole world, but we have to begin a process of creating space so that people can see what we call radical imagination. And that's what I think.
And the only thing I want to say is that I think
If you could phrase it in the form of a question, and then we are going to have to let the other folks ask their questions.
Absolutely, I'm sorry. I was going to say that I guess my concern would be how do you, when you talk about sort of like inherited wealth, I think there's also inherited education, inherited knowledge, and passing down that desire to participate in those, I guess, those situations. How I guess, do you break into that? And I guess that's.
Well,
if I could actually offer one of the solutions that we do like to promote, and again, we can go back to Williamsburg. A friend of mine, when I was in law school, a Jewish brother, a very good friend of mine, he would often say, Marie, I'm all for diversity, but like I learned in Hebrew school, I can't help take care of you guys until my community is taken care of. And I asked him, what is Hebrew school? And he explains to me that when he was K through 12, every day after school, or all day Saturday, in addition to going to the public school, his community provided and funded centers and spaces for all the children in that Jewish community to be able to go to school where they would learn their challenges, they would learn their history, they learn their languages, they learn that you're not just going to go up and be a banker, you're going to learn how to be a banker for your people, and you're going to work in one of our banks, and then when you work in our bank and become the head, you're going to raise up your children in the same way. We often look to the public schools as where our children should be getting educated without remembering that the Jewish community would not allow the Nazis to educate their children, and we have to be clear that our historical relationship to the power dynamics in the society are such that if we are not willing to fund that type of educational experience for our own children, there's nobody else who's going to do it for us. And if we do that type of educational experience for our children, we can control the cultural values that we impart them with, and we can compete with High 97, right? Thank you so much. Right.
I guess you answered
that
culture.
Thank you so much for that, because I think you hit it right on the head. My name is Ty Abrams, and I work with Black and Brown youth here in New York City to get them into top high schools. But one of my concerns is this wealth issue. So my question is going to be centered around the student loan crisis, and specifically what that means for middle-income Black families. So I came from a middle-income Black family, and I had $143,000 of student loan debt from undergrad. And I don't want that to repeat itself for my kids, right? So what can you guys offer for effective solutions for, you know, the youth who are moving up through that whole arena? And what can we say to those young professionals who are stifled by it?
Well, I probably have a view on it that I'm not sure if anyone else will share it, but the way it's structured now, there are programs where, well, put it this way, some people don't like the fact that they have a big student loan. For me, I went to law school later in life, and I decided I'm either going to pay it off all at once or I'm never going to pay it off. The law actually allows that debt dies with you, unlike a lot of other debts. So if you can get an income-based program and you pay what you can, you shouldn't really worry so much about student loan debt. That's an investment in your education and your future. Some people like to pay it off, they make enough money to do it, but others pay off what you can and realize that it's not going to be part of your legacy when you go.
So are you talking about the income-based repayment student loan type programs?
That's one type.
Okay. So for those who may be curious about what some of the programs Attorney Grant is talking about, there are income-based repayment programs which hopefully will continue under this new administration, and different ways of structuring repayment that take into account a percentage of your income. So it's not this high, it may still be high. It's not this base amount that everyone has to pay, but it's tailored to the actual income that you're bringing in. A lot of those programs were ushered in under the Obama administration. Who knows what's happening now and what that will mean, especially as the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau is actually one of the agencies that it really looks like it may be on the chopping block of this administration. But there are additional payment programs that can help with student loan reduction. And I think one of the things that you may be speaking to is the idea that some you may not ever be able to pay off $143,000 a year. I mean, not you personally, but average people in this economy with the job situation that we have, and recognizing that this may be like a lifelong car payment, or this may be like a lifelong, because quite frankly, the cost of education as opposed to the options that are waiting for most people when they get out, there's an imbalance there that we are either going to have to, again, as you said, either I'm going to pay it all off and have an actual plan to do that, or recognize that this is going to be it's like a life insurance plan. You kind of just pay a little bit until you're done, and really have to see what financial situation is going to make the most sense for you. But there are also attorneys that you can speak with who can help you navigate some of the challenges of the student loan debt issues.
Student loan debt is obviously like a national crisis, and we deal with it every day. And I think because of that, there are a lot of sort of negative feelings around the value of education. But when people look at the return on investment of education, it is still by far the best investment anyone can make in terms of outcomes, not only in terms of income, but in terms of health, in terms of civic participation, in terms of family units being maintained, in terms of so many different factors, that it's absolutely the most valuable investment you can make. And I would say at this time, when a baby is born, is not too early to start an education savings plan. There is a 529K, which is a tax deduction. You get a tax deduction for putting money away for your child's education. You can set it up, it's automatic, you don't think about it, and you're so glad 18 years later when you have that nest egg to have for your children's education. It's again it's sort of a no-brainer, and you just need to set it up. It's very easy. It's called a 529K, but that's something as financial counselors we help people set up.
For the future, the fact that we have to incur so much student debt is an issue that bears sports discussion, but that's just another issue.
Right.
So, yeah, I wanted to speak to that. I think that the policymakers within the political economy made a major mistake when the TALK bill was signed into law to provide debt relief for the 1%ers on Wall Street, and not incorporating debt relief for the students. And so,
which is a political decision.
That's a political decision. So I think what we need is, within the next 2 years, particularly in this administration, because I think there's going to be all kind of contradictions coming out, the new person that he wants to nominate as Secretary of Education owns investments in a student loan company that was serving as predatory in terms of trying to extract resources from students. These are contradictions that will enable us to, Dr. King used the term called the creative tension. So here's a creative tension, which I think can enable you and the students at MEGA, I'm talking to the leadership of the student government, selling pies and all that stuff is cool, but let's get real. We need a movement of students, multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-class movement of students in this country to call for debt relief for students. Just as they did for the bankers that he's trying to appoint to his administration, all the billionaires, you're the future, debt relief for students. And look, if you did that, the economy would grow exponentially. Because then you'd be able to, like you say, have money in your pocket to create the generational wealth for yourself and your children, who could then have a leg up to go on to college or to own a business. That's called economic and social mobility. So we need debt relief. So we need a movement.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Hello, my name is Jamal Patterson. I'm part of Capital Strong. We're a group of young professionals who are using cooperative economics to fund development. So my question to Mr. Green when it comes to what they're doing in Mondragon, Jose Maria started a school first in order to do cooperative economics. Is that important to start first school, or should it be the worker, should it be the bank? Because the school is where they branched off from, the graduates, and it was this type of pride for the people in the town to create this school. So is that what we should be doing?
That's right. That's
and
right.
Can it be done in a place like this?
Yes, I think so. Yeah, I think you're absolutely correct. The model there started with education and its pedagogy. The father, Catholic priest, and this is a, you know, hate to use the term, the people of Mondragon were considered I'm gonna use the term, the niggers of Europe in Spain. The history there is that when Hitlerite fascism was raising its head in Europe, Francisco Franco, who was the dictator of Spain and hated those people, allowed Hitler to use their town as a bombing target to train how to, that's right, how to allow the German Air Force to be trained in bombing other parts of Europe. They started there. So these folks were considered the, you know, again, this whole concept of racial superiority existed within the white communities as well, you know, eugenics. So they were perceived as like, you know, nothing. But coming out of World War II, they said, never again.
That's right. That's right.
And they organized themselves, starting with education, to change the values, and then to create this new kind of economic ecosystem that now allows them to have one of the best life expectancies, building health, and building wealth. Starting with education. So I think we can do it here. Working with Center for Law and Social Justice, the CUNY Law Center for Community Economic Development Clinic, and we actually have a collaboration now with Mondragon to help us put that model together here, and working with the unions. 1199 Health and Hospital Workers Union, which is the largest union in the state, one of the largest in the country, has committed to invest educational and training funds for us to train workers up in terms of being part of a new kind of economic ecosystem. Transit Workers Union is joining us as well. They're starting a worker cooperative that's going to be organized around bike shares. You know, that they're trying to link with the hospitals. The doctors are talking about prescribing bikes instead of pills to keep people healthy. So all of this is interrelated, but it's, you know, it's about radical imagination, and that starts with the appropriate type of education that folks need.
I just want to remind us, we could start schools, but we could also go into every project building in the city, which has a community room.
That's right.
You don't have to deal with DOE.
That's right.
You don't have to deal with Regents
That's
exams.
right.
You don't
That's
have to
right.
deal with
That's
testing.
right.
You
That's
can
right.
get the information directly to our children. You bring some pizzas and the mothers and everyone else will follow.
That's right.
And we can create schools that are organic and that are
That's right.
self-sufficient and self-sustaining, that don't require governmental regulation. The same way we can do with SUSUs and micro-lending.
New
and
technology,
control
MOOCs, everything.
There
You
you go.
use that to get it out. That's right.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.
And these will be the final questions, and then we'll go. No, that's you.
Good evening, my name is Michael, I'm from Capital Strong as well. One, do you think we need to create a pipeline of political leadership to kind of begin or to support the, you know, the Commonwealth kind of movement that you're talking about? I ask this because I think about Chowre Lumumba and what he did in Jackson right before, unfortunately, he passed. And and with that coupled with the long line of black electeds we've had in the post-68 era who haven't had that kind of interest in our mind. So one, do we need a pipeline of political leadership trained, developed, and focused at the local level to give backbone and to support the Commonwealth? One, that's one. Two, I think about Alondra Nelson and her book on how out of the Black Panther movement and out of the Black freedom struggle, there's all these community-based health initiatives that, or some of them are still running today.
That's
And
right.
I'm thinking, does a worker co-op, so in our Black African diasporic communities, two things right now. One, aging populations, and two, the overall health problems. Would worker cooperatives be a good fit or be able to be made to work for dealing with aging centers, dealing with, geriatric care, dealing with the other issues that we have? Should we just use worker cooperatives as a model for our community's array of kind of health needs? That's two. Three, Russell Rickford talks a lot about.
For the sake of time, we're going to focus on those top
Those
two.
two are.
Thank you very much. We're gonna get those top two and then we'll move to the next question.
Yeah, there definitely needs to be a pipeline of new political organizers. I don't use the term leaders. We need to start with organizers first, and then see who can be a leader. That's the model that Ella Baker and Fannie Lou Hamer used when they were building the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party in conjunction with the worker cooperatives that they were building in Jackson, Mississippi, and other parts. So yeah, that's what we need. I think the model that Chokwe was trying to do to develop in Jackson, Mississippi, Jackson Rising, is exactly what we should look at. We are in a discussion now, in fact, trying to create an organization called Society for Effective Economic Democracy, which we begin to do that, to create a new generation of leadership that would embrace these values and start trying to implement them. Then in terms of healthcare, yeah, I think healthcare, and there's several other sectors that could adapt to the concept of worker cooperatives, including the transportation system, energy, looking at the organization of decentralized renewable energy in Brooklyn. The energy grid in Brooklyn is shot. Within the next 16 months, we're going to be seeing rolling brownouts. All right, that's been a report that was put out by the governor's office. The infrastructure is gone. And so we're saying, if the infrastructure is gone, let's build a more progressive type of model, decentralized renewable energy, and organize that within the commons, controlled by the people, all right? First starting with the healthcare system, link it to the healthcare system, because that then would reduce healthcare costs. And then if we control that, we can put those resources through not converting the energy, but inverting it back into our local economy, where we could put it into community foundations for education, you name it. But putting it in the commons, organize it in the context of what may be what we call a limited equity co-op that's organized by community and controlled by community and labor. That's community empowerment. So yeah, I think there are a number of different sectors. Housing is another one. Community land trusts, critical. Real estate, critical. Controlling that, not just building it. Who controls it? You know, so those are all the things I think that we need to look at and start looking at key economic sectors that we can then release this entrepreneurial spirit that we heard over there to begin organizing our community. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes.
How is everybody doing today? My name is Jamal Smith. I work for Bed-Stuy Restoration as a career coach. And my question is about the psychological approach that us African Americans feel the need to buy things that have like vanity, to feel like we're secure and we feel like we have money. I think you talked about it earlier. And so I guess my question is more like, what can we do as a society to like get off that mindset, that slave mindset, that we need to feel the need to buy things to feel like we have money, besides actually save up and, you know, invest in things that are more important, like you said, as a house or investing in like a car or things that we could get actual assets and wealth from.
So I'm just gonna say, one of my favorite quotes is, the hardest thing to do is to love people taught to hate themselves, right? So that means organizing is going to be harder, education is going to be harder, value shifting is going to be harder until we get at the heart of the issue, which is that sense of inferiority, which is historical, it's rational, it's the predictable outcome of the circumstances that we were put through and that we continue to experience. So I'm gonna go back to my Hebrew school example, because and I don't like to compare struggle, and I don't like to do Olympics of struggle, but I do think that similarly situated groups can look at what other groups may have done to alleviate some of the suffering that they endured, and going inward, saying never forget, and really wrestling with a lot of the shame that we have around that, right? Really wrestling with a lot of the internalized communal pain that we have. Dr. Tim Tyson says any psychologist will tell you that a candid confrontation with the past is required in order for there to be healing. We must confront what happened, and if you are traumatized, you have to deal with what happened in that trauma so that you can grow through it. And so if we're not willing to do that homegrown education piece, because the public schools can't do it, then all of these other things are outgrowths of that internalized sense of inferiority, but we're the only ones who can fix that. 30 seconds.
Got you. So if I was a high school student, what would you tell me to maybe not go for buying the newest Jordans out, but actually save my money for something new, or something that I could really look forward to in the future, that as a, let's say, 16-year-old that has, I guess, investment to my future?
It's going to be hard for me to convince you that you have a future when the people who are the ones you love and respect the most may have a different perspective. It's difficult for me to tell you not to buy Jordans when I don't have a job to put you in that's going to allow you to develop some of your own self-sustaining sense of esteem. It's difficult for me to tell you don't stand on that corner and sell when I don't have a store shop to put you in to sell. So not saying that there has to be a chicken or an egg, but saying that trying to get that child at 16 to not buy Jordans just missed the first 16 most powerful years of that child's life, where we could have shifted those values so he would have seen the Jordan as an inappropriate investment of his money as opposed to a way of buying esteem. But you got to get him at 5. You can't wait till he's 16, right?
Hi, I'm Patricia. I'm actually a nurse practitioner and from Detroit. So we're actually doing it in Detroit. I started the process with myself. I bought a couple of properties because in Detroit, well, I don't know if everyone knows, but there's a lot of properties very cheap. So I bought 3 properties, a building, and a couple of land, and I did that by working hard with my job to be able to fund it. And I got my family on board. We're also doing investment clubs and getting that all together. So I started with myself, and then also teaching other people about our African American history and learn from it and grow from it. But the question I have with all of that, since I've started the process myself, the legality. So do you guys offer assistance for people to make sure that like paperwork and making sure everything is in order legally so everyone can excel?
That's what lawyers do.
Yeah.
The answer is, of course.
And that's actually one of the reasons why we wanted a consumer attorney on the panel, because it is important that after this you can continue that conversation and can make connections and sit down. Because again, sometimes we have a fear of paper in our community, and we love relationships and kinship networks, and we can sometimes alleviate a lot of the challenges that come up in those networks by sitting down with an attorney, figuring it out. These are questions that everyone has asked. We're not creating anything new, but really committing to professionalizing that process of self-economic sustainability. So congratulations to you.
That's fantastic.
So we want to give our panelists a round of applause. And as you know, we want to, before we leave, I just want the folks from CLSJ, if you could raise your hand just so people can see you. And the piano is there. And so I'm getting a message. And I'm winding down. All right, so our time has come to a close. We really appreciate having you here. Next month, we're going to go really hard at Black-owned businesses and Black entrepreneurship, looking at how we go from individual to business.
February 10th.
In this place at 6:30. We hope to see you there. Thank you so much. And have a good night. And bring a friend.